Start on the chapters that lead us to the third and final exam for our class. Remember, the final exam is not comprehensive, so it's just going to cover from this chapter on through the rest of the semester. This chapter, I think you'll have a little more familiarity with, and it's a little less technical than the last few chapters we've been through because we're going to talk about performance appraisals. I know many of you have had performance appraisals in your jobs or in internships, and at the very least, you all have seen this topic at some point, either like in the HR management class or in another HR class, potentially in the curriculum. So why do we do performance appraisals? We have a lot of different reasons for doing performance appraisals. They often help individual employees to identify goals for them to work on so we can direct their behavior. And we can see employees see how their work contributes to the organization overall and specifically as well to the projects in the department in which they work. We can direct behavior toward organizational strategy and objectives by tying those individual goals to organizational objectives. We can develop employees within the organization and over their careers with developmental feedback. And this is usually something that employees very much value about the performance appraisal process. We can identify talent within the organization, and that talent identification can help us do succession planning, where we're trying to determine who might be a future leader in the organization. By identifying individuals who could be potential leaders, you can then give them training and development to develop their leadership competencies. And then we can also use performance appraisals to identify people or individual employees who are ready for promotions or who would be good in potentially a position that's open. We can also use it for merit pay increases and other rewards, and we'll talk about that in a future chapter because that is a common way to use performance appraisal systems as well. So to do performance appraisals, we want to take subjectivity out of the system as much as we can or out of the process. So we try to do objective observations through metrics, performance metrics that we've determined are important for employees to meet. For every metric that we might use in a performance evaluation, we have to determine if it's results-oriented or behaviorally oriented. Results-oriented are things like financial metrics that how is the business doing financially. These are a little bit fuzzier. These are much more common in higher leadership levels. And when I say they're fuzzier, there are many influences on a lot of these results-oriented metrics. If you think about, for example, profit, what makes an organization profitable from one year to the next might be about what's going on within the organization in which leadership should be responsible or held accountable for how employees are actually implementing the strategy for the organization, but it could also be influenced by outside factors such as a recession. So that's why it's a little fuzzier than behaviorally oriented metrics, which are looking at specific behaviors that we want people to implement in the workplace because we think those behaviors are tied to actually implementing the organizational strategy. When you're updating or creating a new performance appraisal system, one thing you have to remember is just because we can quantify something, just because something might show up in our HR information system, doesn't mean it's an objective measure of performance. It may not be tied to one employee or one team or one department's the work that they do. And so it may not tell us anything about anyone's performance. And there could be outside factors that are related to that particular measurement that have nothing to do with performance. And we can't parse that out from the performance of the employees. So our book makes a really good point of saying that we should apply total quality management principles to the appraisal process. You don't have to know what TQM is, but essentially it's saying that we have to recognize that part of every employee's performance is not just their behaviors, but also, and probably more likely, the work environment they work in and the system they're working under that's influencing what they can and cannot do within the workplace. And so if we can keep that in mind, we might be at least a little fairer in the way that we use these metrics to appraise the performance of our employees. We also have to remember, and one thing I forgot to mention here is that for many organizations, and many of you probably have this experience, some metrics are individual, and so they focus on individual behaviors or results from employees. But a lot of times, and this is becoming much more common in lots of organizations, a lot of our metrics are related to teams and groups that you work in, and even to the whole organization as well, in which case you might have lots of different kinds of metrics within one employee's performance appraisal. So one approach that we can use is the balanced scorecard approach. I've actually never been in an organization that's used this scorecard approach, but I think it is more common in private organizations or publicly traded organizations than it would be in the public sector where I've mostly worked. And that's because a lot of organizations use the balanced scorecard for developing their strategy and developing metrics to determine if their strategy is being implemented well or working. So in this sense, when we use the balanced scorecard, what we're going to do is we're going to divide out the kinds of metrics we might use for employee appraisal into 4 different groups. One is about the financial kind of state of the organization. And so we might look at financial performance. And on this balanced scorecard, they call the metrics KPIs. That means key performance indicators. Our book doesn't use that language, but if you're going into HR or management at all, I would keep that kind of term in your head because that's the much more common term to use in business than metrics generally. So KPIs is key performance indicators. They're simply metrics that we use to measure something in the workplace. So for financial performance, it can be things like revenue or net profit. When we want to look at customer satisfaction, we might use KPIs like number of returns or level of returns, customer satisfaction ratings, that sort of thing. If we want to look at learning and growth, which is how much our employees are developing their knowledge and then how much they're using that to innovate the products and services or processes that are in our workplace, we might have things like employee retention or employee satisfaction survey ratings. And then we also can have what we call internal ratings, and this is looking at the efficiency of the business. It's usually looking more at the policies and procedures that we have. So we might have things like if you're in a factory, machine downtime. Another KPI might be unit costs. And so this is one way that you can develop the metrics to kind of evenly look at these 4 areas across different kinds of employees. We can also have other appraisal formats that are, I would say, probably more common across different kinds of industries. One is ranking formats, and this works just like what we learned about for ranking formats in terms of developing an internal compensation structure. So we'll evaluate employees relative to other employees and rank them, and then we have to rank them on some kind of performance measure. If you only have a few employees, you can do a more holistic ranking. My cat is trying to join us as well for this particular lesson. But you can have a holistic measurement, but it's much more difficult when you have a larger number of employees. So the kinds of rankings that we can do are straight rankings, where you just say you have 10 employees, you just rank them 1 through 10. You can do alternation ranking, where you start with the easiest ranking, so 1 in 10, who's the best employee and who's the worst employee, and then move your way into the middle, which is much, much more difficult to differentiate between employees. And then you can also do a paired comparison ranking where you compare each employee to every other employee, and then you add up the number of times they win in those rankings, and the person who wins the most is the highest ranked employee, and then you just go down through those rankings. You put them in order by the number of times they win the paired comparisons. A much more common approach, I think, in most organizations is rating formats. This is when you have some kind of standard that you actually rate your employees on, usually on like a 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 scale. And each standard has a scale associated with it that's appropriate to that particular standard. I would say this is more common because a rating format gives more information to the employee about why they were appraised or evaluated the way they were. So we can use things like a standard rating scale, a behaviorally anchored rating scale or bars, and management by objectives. I'll show you what each of those looks like in the next few slides. I also want to mention that another format is the essay format. Our book doesn't talk about it very much, but it's simply writing a narrative of how that employee performs in the workplace. And you may give a few examples of how you've seen behavior that employee might demonstrate in different scenarios in the workplace. The most common way I've seen the essay format used is you might have like a rating scales for an employee. And then for each rating scale, the supervisor has to provide a little narrative about why they rated the employee the way they did on that particular scale. Or you have several rating scales, and at the very end of the all of the scales, you might have a little essay about what is the typical performance for this employee. So let me show you these different rating formats. The standard rating scale is one I know you have experience with because this is how we do instructor evaluations at the end of the semester. So here we're asking how often does this employee meet deadlines? So this is a metric that we care about. And then we have a 5-point Likert scale here where every single point has a description or an anchor. And then we just have to evaluate how often we think that this employee meets deadlines. This can be very vague because different supervisors can interpret these scale points very differently. And we'll talk in the next video about how you might actually help make sure that that's more consistent across supervisors. But one way you can increase that consistency is through what we call a behaviorally anchored rating scale, or a BARS. And this is a very similar scale. You'll have another metric. You can use the same metric. I just have a different one here because this is what I pulled from a Google image. And then you have the same 5 points for your Likert scale, but the anchors for each Likert scale actually describe the behaviors that an employee at that rating would have. This is very useful for jobs that you know exactly what employees will do in that job. So you can describe those 5 points, for example, on the Likert scale. It's much more difficult for jobs that I imagine a lot of you have or will have, where you can determine how you do that job to get to whatever the result is that you need to do, or the thing that you need to make for your workplace. In which case, if employees get to determine how they do that work, this kind of scale may not be useful because you can't describe what employees' behavior looks like at each of those points, since each employee could do their own thing. It also is really just complicated when you have very complex work where people might be doing lots of different things and things they've never done before, because again, you won't know what those behaviors look like. So this is probably much easier to use in more entry-level work, and then maybe some basic supervisory work. But as you move up into different levels of leadership, it may or may not be useful. And then of course, with more professional or technical jobs, it may or may not be useful as well. It also, I should mention, this BARS takes a lot of time to develop. So you have to sit down and write each of these anchors, these descriptions, and that takes a while. We also can have management by objectives. Management by objectives, by the way, could be used with any of these other formats. It doesn't mean none of these is exclusive necessarily. They're just different ways that we can look at metrics and develop metrics for employee appraisals. So in management by objectives, what you're doing is you're taking the organizational strategy and you develop organizational objectives that go with that strategy. Then you divide up those objectives over the different levels of hierarchy within your organization. So maybe right under kind of the overall organizational strategy, you'll have different divisions that are implementing that strategy, and you'll have objectives for them. And then within divisions, you'll have departments, or at least in this example you do, where they each have their own objectives as well that are specific to the work the department does. And then within each department, each individual will have an objective or several objectives that's related to that overall organizational objectives. And those individual objectives feed into the departmental objectives that feed into the divisional objectives that feed all the way up into the organizational objectives and strategy. I've used this kind of format in jobs that I've had, and it's very useful for helping employees understand exactly how their work actually supports the organization's strategy, and it helps the organization keep track of who exactly is implementing which aspects or which objectives within that would lead to that strategy. So they can see, like, if something breaks down or performance isn't very good in one part of it, they'll know exactly where that is, and they can go then provide feedback or training or whatever it is that's needed to actually improve performance in that specific objective. So we can evaluate these appraisal formats in 5 different ways. One is employee development criterion. This is the one employees probably care most about. Is this appraisal system helpful for giving employees feedback about their performance and helping them to improve their performance? The administrative criterion is really about how difficult or it is to actually implement this appraisal system. So if you think about, for example, having a behaviorally anchored rating scale, that might take a little bit longer to develop, but it might be easier in terms of implementing, because you've given specific behaviors for supervisors to look for when they're making ratings for employees. So there's a trade-off there on the administrative criterion for that kind of format. The personal research criterion, I think, might be the one that's most confusing for you all. So I gave you 3 examples here on the right of ways that we can look at personal research criterion. The way I think about personal research criterion is helping managers, but also industrial organizational psychologists that might work in our organization, to determine if the things that we're using to kind of predict employee performance or improve employee performance are actually helping. So we might do things like validate employment tests with our performance appraisal system. That means that we might have employees, when they come into the organization, they might actually do some kind of pre-employment test. And then we can use their score and compare it to the way that they perform 6 months into the job, a year into the job, even further out into the job. and with the idea that if you got a higher score on the pre-employment test, you hopefully had better performance once you were in the organization. So that pre-employment test is actually helping us to predict who would be good employees in our organization. We can also just generally predict performance as well. If even if we don't have pre-employment tests, if you have employees who are getting high appraisal ratings or rankings, hopefully they're performing better in their job than other employees even into the future after they've gotten those rankings or ratings. We also can link our training and development to performance. So we could compare employees who've had some kind of training and development with those who haven't to see if their performance appraisal scores or ratings are higher than those who haven't had that training and development. Or you can do it before and after. What were these employees' performance appraisal scores before, and then what were they after they got this training and development? Cost criterion is the fourth criterion we look at. How costly is the system to implement or to even create and implement? Obviously, this is related a little bit to administrative. The more time burden or more people who have to be involved, the costlier the system is. And the validity criterion really looks at how accurate is our performance appraisal system. Is it helping us to differentiate poor and high performers, for example? Many systems actually fail this criterion because everyone gets about the same ratings. But if you ask managers or supervisors, many times they can tell you who kind of their outstanding employees are and who are the kind of poorly performing employees, regardless of what their appraisal ratings or rankings are. So in that case, sometimes the validity of the system isn't very helpful, even if managers and supervisors know the information themselves.